Cool. So my name is Emily Fischer, and I am, thank you, an architect who makes quilted maps. And about 7 years ago, I started my company, Haptic Lab, based in New York. And for those of you who have sort of like a passing familiarity with the word haptic, haptic refers to your sense of touch, not just your touchscreen devices and robotics technology. Sometimes I get some shade from people who work in that field. But haptics, it's not just your hands, right? It's the entire surface of your body, both inside and out. What's unique about haptics, apart from your other senses, is that it's the only sense mechanism we have that can be extended. So if you could imagine like driving a car, the exterior of that car then kind of serves as the exterior of your body, that its movements become your own. And similarly, like a cane that somebody would use to guide themselves down a sidewalk, the tip of the cane begins to act as your hand. So I first became fascinated with haptics when I was studying architecture in grad school back in 2002 at the University of Michigan. And at that time, my mother had just been diagnosed with macular degeneration and glaucoma and like a ton of other eye issues that most people don't get until they're in their 80s. So as a student, I became very aware of the fact that we really privilege the visual in design, and kind of at the sake of everything else. It just seemed like a really lazy and exclusionary way to design. That you're just making something look cool. It's not satisfying the rest of what we need kind of as humans. So I started out, I think one of my first semesters, just designing a lot of stuff that explored haptic wayfinding, like how could I make things that the visually impaired could use to guide themselves. And the first thing I made was a quilted map of Detroit. And after I presented the project, one of my professors kind of took me aside and was like, if you really want to be serious about architecture, you better leave your craft projects at home. And I was like, okay, I really want to be serious. So I did butched it up and did things like braille embedded concrete and tried to be really serious about it. But I kind of, I thought like the quilt idea really had legs, and it was one of those back burner ideas that I kind of always wished I had the time to investigate. And so when I started Haptic Lab, it was very exciting. And these projects are kind of a combination of the craft knowledge I gained growing up in Wisconsin. So quilting techniques, the sort of like craft knowledge combined with my training as an architect. So I use GIS data and now a lot of OSM and OpenStreetMaps data. And what I learned kind of early on in developing these projects was it was my intention to kind of use like all these CAD/CAM tools and rapid prototyping, and I just like immediately realized it wasn't the way to go. There's just like this idiosyncratic beauty that's lost when something is produced by a machine, and like the scale was totally wrong. So now like every single one of my projects is hand-stitched. And the early work I did is almost exclusively like urban maps, like maps of cities, like the New York quilt in the lobby. But I would include kind of my experiences and stuff in the design. So the kind of oddities in the urban landscape that I thought were really interesting, like the oculus of the Pantheon or the fountains in the Piazza Navona. And right now, I would say my work is kind of transitioning and becoming a lot more complex and technically challenging, where this is an image of one of the coastal maps that I've started making. And here's another. And these projects are really like what I call like a Trojan horse project. Like these quilts are like how I start a conversation about the climate crisis. And it's interesting because these coastal quilts, like, yes, they're describing these very vulnerable, like delicate landscapes, but for the most part, my customers like just happen to own like really fancy vacation homes in some of these areas. So it's kind of like a way to like sneak in some, some ideas about how like, yeah, that your beautiful house on this barrier island might not be there in 50 to 100 years, or maybe in our lifetime. So this is a project that's actually on view right now at a gallery in Chinatown, 40 Ludlow Street. This is a climate change map of the Arctic. And I like kind of playing with the perspective now, like the view that you get. And so this is like a top-down view. Most people don't, recognize these land masses until they kind of stand back. And a project I'm launching next week with the Buckminster Fuller Institute. This is a Dymaxion map of the world. And Buckminster Fuller is like one of my design heroes. But what's great about this map, I'm sure most of you are familiar with it, is that it's like this inclusionary diagram. It's all the continents shown interconnected at the same scale, which I think makes it really special. And I guess to kind of like finish up talking about the quilts, it was never just about maps for me. Like, I know maps on things is kind of like the new put a bird on it, and like, like as a designer, I was never interested in just like selling cute maps to people. This was always a research project in my mind, and one that was always about haptics. So one of the questions that I started asking was like, okay, well, how do people find their way? Like, how do humans navigate? And are there other objects and things that we've created that kind of function like the quilts do that I'm making? In kind of answer to that first question, humans are like remarkably terrible at finding our way. Like, we have no internal compass. We're just terrible at finding our way. And in what's called a blindfold deviation test, if I were to take each of you out like in a open field or like a surface parking lot, and I like blindfold you and tell you to walk a straight line, you couldn't do it. Nobody can do it. It doesn't matter if you're sighted or not. That within a couple steps even, you just start turning one way or the other. And in less than an hour, you would have walked a complete circle. And the reason why people walk in circles is really complex and hasn't been answered. That researchers used to think it had something to do with handedness, like you're like left-handed or right-handed and would go one way or the other, or there's like a body asymmetry, like one leg is longer than the other. Neither of those things are true. From what we can tell now, it has something to do with like our vestibular system, which is our inner ear, and how that relates to haptics. But, to kind of balance and counteract these shortcomings, humans have come up with just like this really amazing arsenal of objects, maps being, of course, one of those things, which is like how we are able to kind of find our way despite the fact we don't know what we're doing. So this is a little picture of Australia. And I'm gonna just say this, I'm like not a cultural anthropologist. I'm like not an expert at all. These are just, what I'm describing to you are just things I find interesting. And people make things for lots of different reasons, and just, as an artisan who works with craft artists kind of all over the world, I think people make things because, the utility of the object that's being created, but also a kind of expression of yourself, the authorship. You want to have a part of yourself in the work. And the anthropologist Alfred Gell describes how these objects can transform themselves to become what's called an index. And an index is special because it has agency. It can act on you. It creates a kind of like emotional connection. And it doesn't even have to be an object that's physical. It can be like a Shakespearean play or a song. And so songs are the first maps that we have as humans. And Aboriginal Australians would use what they called song lines, which is a kind of like precognitive way to connect to a landscape where you use your whole body to kind of memorize these songs, some of which are like thousands of stanzas in length. So not only are you singing, but you're dancing, and the whole body of the performer and the audience kind of come together to create the map. So that's one example, song lines. And what do you do in a landscape that just has like no clues visually to find your way? Like, what do you do if you're like in the Arctic somewhere and you have nothing to go from? This is kind of like an imperfect example, but this is what's called an Anoxic. And it's like what I would call like the trail of breadcrumbs method to find your way. What people would do is, every so often just stack a pile of rocks to create a landmark that you could identify. But of course, it's not just a pile of rocks, it's in the shape of a man. And only a human would build something in the likeness of a human. So I think that's a kind of poetic way to talk about wayfinding. These are kind of a terrible photo. This is a Greenlandic coastal map. As you can see, there's a lot of like contouring. It's very three-dimensional. And these represent coastal fjords. So to find your way, you'd like use these to kind of memorize the landscape. And what happens is this cool like mental translation, this like spatial reasoning we have where we can like touch something that's like only this big, but it can scale up in our minds to represent something that's like the scale of a like massive glacier. So moving on, what do you do if you find yourself in a landscape where there's just really nothing, like you're just really out there? And what do you do if it's cloudy and you can't use the night sky or star navigation to find your way? And this next example is probably my favorite, like haptic index. This is what's called, this is a stick map. They're from Micronesia or the Marshall Islands. And I just think these are like the most beautiful things. If you want to see one, the Metropolitan Museum of Art has one on display. That's pretty cool. But what's unique about the stick maps is that they're not a pure map. What they represent are diagrammatically ocean swells. So it's my understanding of how somebody would use this is you would kind of hold it to your chest and get in your dugout canoe. And you could kind of use it to interpret ocean waves. And that's what you would use to kind of find the next island. And I think this is just like the most perfect expression of embodiment in design, that we're using our bodies to kind of reach out and connect to a landscape. Unfortunately, the Marshall Islands are all going to be underwater, probably in our lifetime. The islands are only 6 feet on average above sea level, so it's kind of heartbreaking to think about how, like, the memory of, this place and how it was navigated are just like completely eradicated. And I think, I don't know, I experience this like sense of urgency right now where our world is changing so rapidly and we're very disconnected from our physical world and physical selves. And we have all this technology that we use, but it's kind of just like pushing these ideas and senses like further away from us. And something I try to do in my work as a designer is to reconcile this mind-body split we've created to paraphrase the architect Toyo Ito, that we have two bodies now. We have a body of information. We have this externalized brain we've created that we're always like trying to access. But our second body is still physical and still craves things like light and wind. And that's what satisfies our emotional needs. And that's, I guess in a broader sense, kind of like where our survival lies. But I don't know, not to get like dark with you or anything, but like maybe our evolutionary track is not to be human at all. Maybe we're just like gonna digitize our consciousness and like upload ourselves and become these like sad space cyborgs. But my hope is we don't. But the stick maps give me hope and encourage me, because in a way I think what they represent is our unique ability to adapt, and that we can adapt to a landscape. We can deal with constant change, and it's sort of like our very recklessness that gives us our advantages in life. It's like what some people call the insanity gene, that we don't fear throwing ourselves into the unknown. And the expression of the stick map then becomes something like, all we need to do is just grab the map and the dugout canoe, and we can kind of like just paddle out to the next proverbial island, knowing there may not be another island. We're just like paddling out into our own destruction. But I do think there's that sense of exploration, that maybe we discover something that we never could have imagined before. And that's something that excites me as a designer and a human. That maybe this can lead to the development of like a haptic stick map to the stars, and we can use our assets as kind of thinking humans to keep exploring and keep putting ourselves out there. All right, thank you.